History of Jerusalem in Art, Realities and Fantasies. How Art Reveals the Historic Multiculturalism of Palestine and Jerusalem, by Dr. Jacqueline Taylor Basker.
One night when I was sleeping, I had a dream so fair. I stood in old Jerusalem beside the temple there.
There are many realities and fantasies about Jerusalem in art. Jerusalem. In 1482, a visiting priest described Jerusalem's inhabitants. Saracens, Greeks, Syrians, Jacobites, Abyssinians, Nestorians, Armenians, Gregorians, Maronites, Turkomans, Bedouins, Assassins, Druze, Mamelukes, Latin and Orthodox Christians, and Jews. Few places, if any, have been the subject of so many biased, inaccurate, or incomplete presentations in publications and the media. Jerusalem, attacked 52 times, captured and recaptured 44 times, besieged 23 times, and destroyed twice. The timeline of Jerusalem from 7000 BC to the present. From ancient Proto-Canaanite period through classical antiquity, Middle Ages, early modern period, and modern era. Despite the claim that there never was a Palestine and that the Palestinians were just Arab invaders, there is a long history of settlement in Palestine. Ancient records use the name Palestine going back to the Philistines or Canaanites, 12th century BCE, and the Romans applied the name to Judea in the 2nd century BCE. This is a print by Adrian Rieland in 1712, which is a timeline of historical references to the name Palestine. The article by Philippe Bostrom in Haaretz in May 2018, covering the ceremony opening the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, was entitled "Jerusalem, the Not-So-Eternal Capital of the Jewish People," and it pointed out that Jerusalem functioned as their capital only for short periods in history, despite the claims of Netanyahu in his speech that it had been the capital of Israel for 3,000 years. The reality is that Jerusalem has been a major center since Neolithic times. The reality is that the sacred sites and names of today's monotheistic religions are based on ancient Canaanite names and sites. They invented the first alphabet. They had profound influence on Greek culture, its mythology, its language and alphabet. They founded the first city-state in Thebes, the beginning of democracy. And here is the oldest inscription from 10th century BCE, found in Jerusalem in an unknown Canaanite language. Archaeology suggests that the first settlement was near Gihon Spring around 4500 to 3500 BCE. The first mention of the city was in around 2000 BCE in the Middle Kingdom Egyptian execration texts, where the city was recorded as Rusalimon. The root SLM in the name is thought to refer to either peace, compared with salam or shalom in modern Arabic and Hebrew, or Shalim, the god of dusk in the Canaanite religion. Ancient art reveals the reality that Jerusalem was a major Canaanite hub in the Levant. Canaan was a large and prosperous area, independent or under Egypt. Semitic speaking, it stretched from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Israel, also known as Phoenicia. Its ritual sacrifice practices influenced the Hebrews in their temple liturgies. This Canaanite amulet of a schematic nude goddess in the Egyptian style from around 1550 BCE from Tel El Ajul in Gaza reveals the multicultural roots of Canaan and Jerusalem. This sculpture shows the fantasy of the modern Canaanite Zionists. It's called Nimrod by Yitzhak Danziger. It's made of red Nubian sandstone from Petra. It shows Nimrod uncircumcised with a bow and falcon on his shoulder, revealing Egyptian influence upon the modern artist. He was part of a group called the Modern Canaanites, which was a cultural ideology founded in 1939 and was very influential on Israeli art, literature, and politics. Its roots were in extreme right-wing fascism, especially Italian and revisionist Zionism. They believed the Middle East was Hebrew-speaking in antiquity. They hoped to revive this Hebrew nation for Arabs as well, not connected to Jewish and Muslim pasts that they thought was backwards and medieval. They opposed the state of Israel as a Jewish people, since the state should be rooted in territory and language, and one could be a Jew anywhere. Israel was only a recent anecdote in Jewish history. They believed the land of Israel was the land of ancient Canaan, the whole Fertile Crescent, and closer to other peoples of the region than to Judaism, from which the Israelis should disassociate themselves. The biblical monarchs were not Jewish, but Hebrew, part of the ancient Near East culture. They pursued scholarship of Ugaritic and Canaanite culture and mythology. They caused much controversy, many arrests, and even some bombings. This tradition of intellectuals criticizing the state of Israel in its current form can be seen in contemporary intellectuals as the writer Meron Benvenisti, who calls Israel a Herrenvolk democracy or master race democracy due to its discrimination against the Palestinians. Avraham Berg, intellectual and politician, said Israel must shed its illusions and choose between racist oppression and democracy. Western art produced many scenes of fantasy in its biblical art, particularly in the 19th century. To the left is Tissot's picture of David and Goliath, and to the right is the reality of the irony of Palestinian boys protesting near Jewish settlements using David's weapon and tactics. David conquered Jerusalem in 1010 BC. David was a complex and controversial character, both in the Bible and in representations in art. On the left, he's shown as a simple shepherd boy in this early Christian catacomb painting, which contrasts greatly with him being shown as a king being coronated in Amiens Cathedral. To have a king for Israel was a very controversial move with much opposition. To the right is an illustration of his wife, a former lover, Bathsheba, who he was able to marry after he had her husband murdered at the Amman citadel. He made Jerusalem the capital, but there are many conflicts about David reflected both in art and new scholarship. So to review the historical realities We know Salem was described in Egyptian records as a ruling city during the Middle Bronze Age. From Egyptian records, here's a foot of an Egyptian official from a sculpture found in Palestine. Then we know that Jerusalem was ruled by Hararian kings, not Hebrews. And here's a bead from that period. And the Israelites are first mentioned in Canaan about 1210 BC. But then we know that Salem collapsed the mid-1100 BC, as many other Bronze Age cities did, and the causes are not quite known. It was reestablished with monumental architecture, some believed to be built by King David and Solomon. And Zionist scholars, as Eilat Mazar, say they found David's palace in Jerusalem, but others argue about the dating and dispute the claim. Solomon followed his father, King David, in 960 BCE. Here's a reconstruction of the first temple built in Jerusalem, fulfilling his father, King David's plan, who had left many blocks of stone and gold for the project. An agreement was made with the king of Tyre, who provided technology and materials, especially lumber from Lebanon, and Phoenician master builders who knew how to do large monuments. They used Phoenician temple architecture as a model. It was later destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC, but there's really no evidence to date that it really existed on the Temple Mount. Some archaeologists claim that the Wailing Wall was actually a Roman fortress wall. This 10th century BCE defensive wall, perhaps built by Solomon, between the Temple Mount and what is claimed by some to be David's ancient city, is disputed by many scholars. It is now located in the Arab-Palestinian section of Silwan in East Jerusalem and is a highly contested area. Art reveals that Solomon was important for both medieval Muslims and Christians. Left a painting of King Solomon, shown speaking to the animals from Mughal India, and to the right, King Solomon greeting the Queen of Sheba in a medieval tapestry. The styles are quite different between Islamic depictions of Solomon in art and those of the West, and we wonder why there is this difference in style. There was nothing in early Islam and the Quran that forbade art. Rather, only forbidden was the worship of pagan idols or images. Painting in the new Islamic culture was influenced by Neoplatonic ideas, and it focused not on imitating nature as in Western art, but in creating a conceptual world, not in competition with God's creation, purposely rejecting perspective and the third dimension. Philosophers such as Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd emphasized the importance of imagination in the arts. Realism was rejected, and medieval Islam began producing art where figures and space were flat, indicating a spiritual perspective that focused on the eternal essence of forms and the relationship between God's existence and the transient world of nature, to show the world as God sees it, not as humans do. In the West, during the Middle Ages, art was also influenced by Neoplatonism and the ideas of Western theologians as Anselm of Canterbury, John Scotus, Bonaventure, Thomas Aquinas, and Bernard of Clairvaux, who touched upon themes such as the idea of beauty, the vision of God, and the image of Christ. The iconoclast controversy was decided in favor of the use of art in religion, and a theory of beauty developed. Thomas Aquinas also saw beauty, as the Muslims did, as a conceptual activity of the mind. However, he emphasized that beauty was caused by the form of the object. More specifically, the senses of sight and hearing are those through which the beholder perceives the form. For Thomas, these senses are the most important ones for cognition. Therefore, they are the ones employed in perceiving the beautiful. Thomas maintains the objectivity of beauty in the sense that beauty resides in the object. In other words, beauty is not a concept of the mind of the beholder imposed onto a given object. It is found in the tangible forms of what is presented in nature. Thus, Western art tended to focus on the color, volume, textures, and perspective of the visual world as presented to the viewer. There's no certain evidence of a united monarchy, no evidence that Jerusalem was always the capital of the Jews at this time. After the death of Solomon, the Jews split into two parallel kingdoms. Samaria became the capital of northern Israel, and Judah had Jerusalem as its capital. Animal sacrifice, common in the Near East, continued on Canaan altars for Baal and for Yahweh, probably on the site of the Temple Mount. There was continual fighting. Samaria was destroyed ultimately by John Hyrcanus the Maccabee in 108 BCE. Babylon destroys Jerusalem in 586 BCE. The temple and city were destroyed, and it was not used as a capital by the Babylonians. In 539, King Cyrus of Persia permits the Jews to return and rebuild the temple, the actual second temple, also named the Temple of Zerubbabel, after the then governor of Judah. Jerusalem then became the capital for the Jews of Judah. From 445 to 425 BCE, Nehemiah rebuilds Jerusalem's walls. Here's a beautiful etching by Gustave Doré, 19th century artist, of Nehemiah viewing the ruins of the walls of Jerusalem. In 332, Alexander the Great conquered Jerusalem, and the Jews welcomed Alexander into Jerusalem to fulfill Daniel's prophecy about his great kingdom. However, he wasn't impressed with their culture or people, but let the tolerant Persian laws remain. He gave Jews special privileges. After his death in 200 BCE, the power went to the Seleucid Empire, who put the ruler Antiochus IV in place, and he changed the tolerant policies and enacted harsh measures, siding with Hellenized Jews to consolidate power. He banned religious rites and ordered the worship of Zeus. The Maccabees led a successful revolt under Simon and retook the temple. Modern scholars see this situation as a civil war between conservative Jews in the country and Hellenized Jews in Jerusalem. In 160 to 167, the Maccabean revolt returns Jerusalem to Jewish control after 25 years of fighting. But Simon Maccabee was murdered by his son-in-law, and then John Hyrcanus I becomes both king and high priest. The art above by Wojciech Stadler from Poland in the 19th century romanticizes these events that were violent and full of butchery and slaughter, both by the Seleucids and Jews on Jews. Below is a picture of so-called Maccabean graves that are tourist destinations in Israel, but actually they are not Maccabean graves. They contain pagan or Christian graves centuries after the Maccabeans. The Hasmonean Jewish dynasty was begun by Simon Maccabeus and was semi-autonomous under the Seleucids from 141 BCE. Jerusalem remained capital, though, for less than a century. Internal quarrels weakened the city, and in 63 BCE, the Romans invaded, and Judah became a Roman province. The Romans installed Antipater the Idumean as governor, and his son Herod became king. Under Herod, Jerusalem was not the capital of the Jews. He rebuilt Samaria, the ancient capital of Israel, that competed with Jerusalem. Next to the Temple Mount, he built the Tower of Antonia for Roman garrisons to monitor the temple. The Hasmoneans declared themselves to be both kings and high priests. This was not acceptable for many Jews. To gain popularity, he made Hanukkah an 8-day feast to celebrate Maccabees' conquest, to be as important as Sukkah, but the feast is not in the Bible or in the Torah. The Feast of Herod, with the beheading of St. John the Baptist, is an extremely large painting by the German Silesian artist Bartholomäus Strobel the Younger. He lived around 1591 to 1650. It is now in the Prado in Madrid. It is an example of how Western art often appropriated biblical scenes from Jerusalem and Palestine to make statements about their own society, creating fantasies derived from historical realities. The painting shows two scenes from the biblical account of the death of John the Baptist. The main part of the painting on the left shows the banquet of Herod Antipas at which his daughter Salome produced the head of John the Baptist. The much smaller execution scene is shown on the right-hand side, to the right of the column, dividing the picture space. The figure includes many portraits of leading figures of the 30 Years' War, and probably other less well-known court figures. It is an example of how the West used the Bible to make statements. Its allegorical appeal to the Christian world was to save Strobel's doomed home country of Silesia, which had suffered greatly from the wars. An image of the head of John the Baptist on a platter appears on the coat of arms of Strobel's home city, which is probably the message of the painting. The only one reacting is Herod, dressed in Middle Eastern clothing. The others, in contemporary dress, ignore the head and are busy eating or posing. They are portraits of many kings, aristocrats, clergy of the time. They are indifferent to John's beheading as they are indifferent to the sufferings of Silesia. They include Henry IV of France pulling a cloth over the fruits of victory with an admiral, generals, counts, and their assassins. At the table, there are queens as Marie de' Medici, kings, and aristocracy. The head of John the Baptist is either a Calvinist Protestant duke or Charles I of England, who was beheaded soon after the painting. Salome, who is bare-breasted, probably does not represent anyone. The dog, often used in symbols in European paintings, here sits up like a lion that may represent the Dutch Republic. In 37 BCE, the Roman client, Jewish Hasmonean king Herod, renovates a second temple, which is actually a third temple, and adds a western wall. In 30 CE, Jesus is crucified in Jerusalem. This is the earliest representation of the crucifixion in an illuminated manuscript from the Syriac-Rabbula Gospels around 586 CE. Jesus wept over Jerusalem in the Gospels, and he said, "And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it. Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace." In 63 CE, the Roman general Pompey captured Jerusalem, The Jews revolted, and then the Romans destroyed Jerusalem finally in 70 CE. The painting of the siege and destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans by David Roberts, one of the most famous 19th century painters, was dedicated to historical accuracy based on the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus. Stones from the Western Wall thrown down by the Roman soldiers in the street can still be found in Jerusalem, and on the famous Arch of Titus, the relief sculpture shows the spoils from the destroyed temple in Jerusalem being carried off by the Roman soldiers. In 135, the Emperor Hadrian rebuilt Jerusalem as the Roman city renamed Aelia Capitolina. Hadrian was at first sympathetic to the Jews and allowed them to return and rebuild the temple in another location. However, this provoked another Jewish revolt led by Bar Kokhba that was ultimately crushed. Jews were not allowed in the city for almost 2 centuries afterwards, and Christianity began to rise. Here's a coin of Bar Kokhba called the Son of the Star, shown with the temple and the Messianic star, since he proclaimed he came to the Jews from heaven, a prince with messianic implications. Miracles were attributed to him, including spewing out flames, according to the church historian Eusebius. After Jerusalem's defeat, Hadrian tries to destroy Judaism. Jewish prisoners were sold for the price of a horse. Teaching Mosaic law was forbidden. Judea was renamed Palestine, and pagan sanctuaries placed over Jewish sacred sites. A temple to Jupiter was built on the site of the temple. Hadrian's statue was placed in the Holy of Holies, and the goddess Aphrodite placed on the site of the tomb of Jesus. A marble statue of a pig was placed at the southern gate of Aelia, and Jews were not allowed in Jerusalem. No Jewish armies existed until 1915, when they were recruited for the British Assyrian Jewish Refugee Mule Corps. In 313, Constantine legalized Christianity with his Edict of Milan. Here's his colossal head from Rome, approximately 6 feet tall, just the head. The whole figure was around 40 feet tall, 12.5 meters. The Christians began moving back into Jerusalem, which was renamed Jerusalem again. Jews were allowed to enter the city once a year to pray at the wall. Here is the amazing mosaic map from Madaba, Jordan, from 542. It has an extremely accurate depiction of the region, including a detailed map of Jerusalem. The Christians had moved to Madaba from Karak in the 6th century and built this church, and when it was renovated in the 19th century, this mosaic was found under the church floor. Subsequently, other mosaics were found under the houses of the local Christians, and fortunately the pastor was a priest who was a fan of the classics and a fan of the arts and worked very hard to preserve the heritage. Here's a painting done by the studio of Raphael for the Vatican, showing Constantine kneeling before Pope Sylvester I, promising him control of Rome and all of the Western Empire. Of interest is the rear of the painting, where there are Solomonic columns, twisted columns, supposedly that Constantine took from the temple in Jerusalem and gave to the Pope for the new Basilica of St. Peter. In 325, Jews were allowed to enter the city once a year to pray at the wall. And in 361, Julian the Apostate became emperor and permitted Jews and other religions to come back to live in Jerusalem to counter the influence of Christianity, which he hated because he had been abused much by Christians, kidnapped and kept as a child in a very difficult situation. Jewish temple rebuilding began. However, the rebuilding of the temple by the Jews ended with the death of Julian and a massive earthquake, typical of earthquakes of this region. In 360, the control of Jerusalem goes back to the Eastern Church under Theodosius I. He declares Nicene Christianity the state church and Jerusalem under the Eastern Church. In 386, Jerome moves to Jerusalem, begins translating the Bible, the Vulgate. Many monasteries were founded, and in 451, the Council of Chalcedon confirms Jerusalem as a patriarchate. The reality of Jerome's cave in Bethlehem can be seen in the photograph of what the cave looks like today. The fantasy is shown by Dura's drawing of Jerome's study, complete with wild animals, following the tradition of the church that Jerome wrote with lions, etc., in his study. In 613, the Jews revolt against the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. Their leader, Nehemiah ben Hushel, helped the Sasanians gain control of Jerusalem. So in 614, the Persians, the Sasanian Empire, captured Jerusalem with the help of Jewish and Arab soldiers. The Jews came back to the city and arranged to build the third temple with a new high priesthood, but this was the last time they were in power. The Christians revolted in a few months, and Jews were killed or fled. The Patriarch Modestus was appointed over the city, and churches were rebuilt. Then again, Persians and Jews returned, attacked the city, and Byzantine Christians were massacred. Sources say the city was burnt down, but there's no proof. However, the true cross was captured. 617, the Persians reversed the policy and decided to side with the Christians over the Jews, and no Jews were allowed in. In 630, the Byzantine Christians recaptured Jerusalem, and the Persian leader's son converts to Christianity, makes peace with the Byzantines. Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, then marches back into Jerusalem with the true cross and the backing of a Jewish leader who converted and received an oath of protection for the Jews. However, 7 years later, Heraclius reneges on his oath to the Jews, who were expelled and massacred. This painting from 14th century in Santa Croce in Italy shows Heraclius beheading his enemy on the left. The head was of his enemy, the Persian king Khosroes, who had been the one who had stolen the true cross from Jerusalem. And on the right, he's shown entering Jerusalem with the true cross. In 620, Muhammad ascends to heaven from a rock in the center of where the Jewish temple was thought to be, on his night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem. This painting of Muhammad ascending is part of an interesting and diverse tradition of representing him. Sometimes he's shown without a face, or with a veil over his face, or with light surrounding him, or with a face. This painting is by the artist Sultan Muhammad from 16th century Safavid Iran. In 624, Jerusalem loses its place as the point for Muslim prayers to be directed to, and now it's been changed to Mecca. 625, however, Muhammad names Al-Aqsa Mosque as one of the three holy places for Muslims. 636, there's the siege of Jerusalem, and by 637, Caliph Umar the Great conquers it and walks into Jerusalem on foot with great respect for the holy places. He makes an agreement with the residents called the Covenant of Umar that guarantees non-Muslims freedom of religion, and for the first time since the Romans, Jews are again allowed to live and worship freely in Jerusalem. This German print, 19th century artist Otto Finkenscher, shows Omar as not a menacing, invading infidel, but rather a heroic figure due to his respect for Jerusalem when he entered. Muslim art also shows Omar with respect and affection. This Persian print shows him with Satan, who had led him into a mosque. It's from Baghdad in the 16th century. And Satan shows him one man is praying and the other man is sleeping. And Satan explains that he would destroy the man who is praying, since he is in the ecstasy of the love of God, while the sleeping man is only in oblivion. This helps Omar to become more discerning and wise, and gets the name of the discerner. He rejected killing the man due to his compassionate nature for the underdog, and he actually established the first welfare state, Beit al-Mal, which aided the elderly, the needy, the orphans, widows, and disabled, that ran for hundreds of years in the 7th century and into the 8th century, into the Abbasid era. The Haram al-Sharif, the Dome of the Rock, was built in Jerusalem by 691. Its architecture reflects the three faiths of the book. The columns in the front reflect the Hellenist classical style and the Second Temple. The dome and the floor plan was copied from the Christian Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the Arabic calligraphy surrounding it and the crescent at the top reflects Islam. Thus, by the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the medieval period, the three religions of the book are well established in Jerusalem. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have significant identities with the history and the place of Jerusalem.